If you've spent any real time in church, you've probably heard this sentence at least once, usually said with a soft voice and a meaningful pause. The word Jesus used for God, Abba, it's not a formal word. It's what a little Aramaic toddler would call his father. It's baby talk. It means daddy. It's one of the most quoted linguistic facts in modern Christianity. It shows up in sermons, worship songs, best-selling books on prayer, seminary lectures, small group curriculum. It's the emotional centerpiece of entire theologies of intimacy with God. The idea that when Paul writes in Romans that we cry out, Abba, Father, he's telling us we get to talk to the creator of the universe the way a toddler babbles at their dad. Not formal, not distant, childlike. Daddy. It's a beautiful idea. It has comforted an enormous number of people. And it is very likely not true, at least not in the way it's almost always presented. Here's what most people never get told along with that sentence. This specific claim, Abba means daddy, traces back to one particular, very influential 20th century scholar. And 30 years after he made that argument, one of the most respected linguists in the field of biblical studies published a formal, detailed rebuttal, using the same Aramaic and Hebrew evidence, but reaching almost the opposite conclusion. That rebuttal has been sitting in the academic record for well over 3 decades, and it has barely made a dent in what actually gets preached from the front of most churches. This video is going to walk through both sides of that argument carefully, so you can see exactly where the popular version came from, exactly what the counter-evidence says, and this is the part that actually matters for your own life. What Abba really seems to have meant, and why the corrected version might be an even more powerful thing to build your prayer life on than the version most of us grew up hearing. Because here's the thing worth sitting with before we even get into the linguistics. If Abba doesn't mean daddy the way you've been told, that doesn't make the moment less intimate. It might mean something even weightier. It might mean Paul wasn't describing a toddler's babble at all, but something closer to a legal, permanent, unshakable status. The confident voice of a fully adopted adult son who knows, beyond doubt, that he belongs in the family and has every right to walk into the room and speak. That's a very different picture of prayer than God lets us be as needy and small as a baby. It's closer to, God has made you a full, legitimate heir, and the word you use for him reflects that standing, not your smallness. It's worth being clear about what kind of correction this actually is before we go any further, because it's easy to hear the popular version is wrong and assume this is going to be a video about deflating something precious. It isn't. Nobody in this disagreement, not the scholar who started the popular reading, not the scholar who challenged it, is arguing that God is distant or that Jesus' relationship with the Father lacked warmth. The disagreement is narrower and more interesting than that. It's about exactly what kind of warmth this specific word was carrying, and what that implies about your own standing when you use it. So here's where we're headed for the next 40 minutes. First, the 3 actual verses in the New Testament where this word shows up, and what they say in context. Then, where the baby talk idea actually came from, a specific scholar, a specific argument, and why it caught on so completely. Then, the corrective evidence, what Abba actually meant in the Aramaic and Jewish sources of Jesus' own time, and why it doesn't hold up as a toddler's word. And finally, what the word's real meaning, adoption, inheritance, unshakable family status, actually implies about how you're invited to approach God when you pray. Stay through all of it. The corrected version, once you see it, is hard to unsee, and it changes what Abba, Father, is actually asking of you and offering you every time you say it. Let's start with the raw material. Every single place the word Abba actually appears in the entire New Testament. There are exactly 3, and it's worth noticing something odd about all of them before we even look at what they mean. The first is in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before the crucifixion. Jesus, in obvious anguish, praying alone, says, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. This is Jesus at his most exposed, not teaching a crowd, not answering a trap question from religious leaders, but alone, afraid, asking his Father directly to change what's about to happen, and then submitting anyway. The second is in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8, verse 15. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. Notice the specific legal word sitting right next to Abba here, adoption. Paul isn't setting up a scene of childhood intimacy. He's setting up a legal transition from slave to adopted son. The third is in Galatians chapter 4, verse 6, and it's almost word for word the same construction. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Same pairing, sonship, inheritance, and the cry of Abba. It's worth slowing down on the context of that Galatians passage specifically, because Paul spends the verses right before it building a very deliberate legal picture. In Galatians 4, he describes an heir who, while still a child, is no different from a slave, though he is the owner of everything, kept under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. Then, he writes, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. Only after laying out that entire legal transition from slave-like minor to redeemed to formally adopted heir does Paul add, and because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. The word Abba doesn't show up as a stray, sentimental detail. It shows up as the punchline of an argument about legal status that Paul had already been building for several verses. Here's the detail that should catch your attention immediately. All 3 times this word appears in the Greek New Testament, it is immediately followed by its own translation. Abba, ho pater, Abba, Father. Every single time. The New Testament writers clearly assumed their Greek-speaking audience wouldn't know what Abba meant on its own, so they translated it on the spot, back to back, as if it were a set phrase. Almost a technical or liturgical formula, not a passing bit of baby babble color commentary. That detail alone is a clue. If Abba were simply understood as an emotionally loaded, obviously understood nursery word, something as universally recognizable as, say, an English speaker hearing dada, you wouldn't necessarily need to immediately gloss it in formal Greek prose 3 separate times, in 3 separate letters, by 2 different authors, decades apart. The fact that it's treated almost like a fixed technical term, always translated the same way, suggests something more structured than baby talk. A specific address, tied to a specific status, that early Christians were quoting deliberately, possibly from a shared early prayer tradition going back to Jesus himself, since it shows up untranslated, transliterated straight from Aramaic into Greek letters, in contexts as different as personal anguish in a garden and formal theological argument in 2 separate letters to 2 separate churches. There's a technical reason scholars take this pattern seriously. When historians try to identify which words and phrases in the Gospels most plausibly go back to Jesus' own actual speech, what specialists sometimes call the ipsissima vox, the very voice, one of the strongest kinds of evidence is exactly this, an Aramaic word preserved untranslated inside otherwise Greek text, especially when it shows up independently in unrelated documents written by different people, in different decades, for different audiences. Paul, writing to a Roman church he'd never visited and a Galatian church he had visited, both times reaches for the same untranslated Aramaic word, in the same paired format, to describe the same experience of the Spirit. That's a strong sign this wasn't a common Greek expression Paul coined himself. It's a fossil, preserved because it was already fixed in the earliest Christian prayer vocabulary, quite possibly because it was remembered as the specific word Jesus himself used. Now, Here's where the popular reading kicks in. If you've heard a sermon on this passage, the emotional beat almost always lands the same way. Abba is presented as the equivalent of a small child saying Dada, pure, unself-conscious, dependent intimacy. The takeaway is usually something like, you don't need to approach God formally, with careful theological language. You get to approach him the way a toddler runs up to their father, arms out, no pretense, total trust. That's a genuinely moving image. It is also, as we're about to see, resting on a piece of scholarship that has been formally and specifically challenged, not by a skeptic trying to undercut Christian intimacy with God, but by a serious linguist working through the same Aramaic and Hebrew sources, who came away convinced the popular version had overstated its case in a way that actually matters. Before we get to that challenge, it's worth understanding exactly how the popular version became so popular in the first place, because it didn't emerge from nowhere, and knowing where it came from is part of what makes the correction land. Before we trace this back to the specific scholar who made Abba means daddy into common knowledge, and the specific argument that eventually pushed back against him, it's worth pausing for a second. If tracing a widely repeated idea back to where it actually started, and checking whether the evidence holds up, is useful to you, this channel does exactly that regularly, across all kinds of questions people usually just accept because they sound right. If that's valuable to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. And there's a comment section below if there's a specific, everyone knows this, Bible claim you want traced back to its actual source. Okay, back to the word. Because up to this point, we've only looked at what the New Testament itself does with Abba. 3 verses, all paired with a translation, all tied to sonship and adoption rather than childhood cuteness on the surface of the text. What comes next is the story of how a single influential scholar's specific claim about this word became the default sermon illustration for 2 generations of preachers, and why, decades later, that claim didn't hold up as well as it first seemed to. The Abba means daddy idea is most closely associated with a German New Testament scholar named Joachim Jeremias, one of the most influential Bible scholars of the 20th century. In his work on the historical Jesus and the Lord's Prayer, published through the 1960s and into his 1971 volume on New Testament theology, Jeremias argued that Abba belonged to the register of small children's speech, comparable to how young children in many languages address their fathers with a simple, repeated syllable before they're capable of more complex speech. He suggested that no other example existed in the entire body of ancient Jewish prayer literature available to him, of anyone addressing God directly as Abba, and concluded that Jesus' use of it represented something genuinely unprecedented, an intimacy with God so close it borrowed the vocabulary of nursery speech. Jeremias wasn't a fringe figure making a wild claim to get attention. He was one of the most cited New Testament scholars of his generation, deeply immersed in rabbinic literature, and his broader work on the historical Jesus and the Lord's Prayer was, and largely still is, treated as foundational. That reputation is a big part of why the Abba equals baby talk claim spread as fast and as far as it did. It wasn't coming from a popular level devotional writer, it was coming from a heavyweight academic specialist, which gave preachers a sense of citable authority when they repeated it. This was a compelling, well-researched argument from a genuinely serious scholar, and it spread quickly, not just through academic channels, but into popular Christian teaching, because it offered something preachers could use immediately, a linguistic argument, apparently backed by expert authority, for a very appealing theological point. Abba as daddy became shorthand for an entire vision of prayer, radical intimacy, childlike trust, permission to approach God without formality. For about 2 decades, this reading was treated as close to settled fact in a huge amount of popular Christian teaching. And then, in 1988, a different kind of scholar took a much closer, more technical look at the actual linguistic evidence Jeremias had used and found real problems with it. That scholar was James Barr, a highly respected specialist in Semitic languages, publishing in the academic journal of Theological Studies under the title Abba Isn't Daddy. Barr's argument wasn't a theological objection. He wasn't trying to make God seem more distant. It was a philological one. He went back through the same Aramaic and Hebrew sources and argued that Jeremias's linguistic case didn't actually hold together as tightly as it had been presented. Barr's central point was this. In the Aramaic spoken in Jesus' time and region, Abba wasn't a word reserved for small children. It was, functionally, simply the ordinary, everyday word grown adult sons used to address their own fathers, attested in later Jewish literature being used respectfully by fully grown men, not only toddlers. Barr pointed to examples in rabbinic and Talmudic material where the term shows up used by adult sons, and even as a title of respect applied to certain revered teachers and elders. Not something a grown man would be embarrassed to say, the way an adult would be embarrassed to still call their father by a toddler's nickname in a formal setting. Barr described Abba as belonging to a familiar, warm, everyday register of speech, as opposed to more formal or ceremonial language. But familiar and warm is not the same claim as babyish. Plenty of languages have a warm, everyday word for father that adult children use their entire lives without it ever being restricted to nursery speech. The same way an adult English speaker might still call their father dad at 40 years old, without anyone hearing that as baby talk, or the way modern Hebrew and Arabic speakers today still use Abba and Baba respectively as the normal adult word for father, not a term they're expected to graduate out of. Barr's point was that Jeremias had taken a word that was intimate and everyday and mistakenly treated its intimacy as evidence of childishness, when in the actual historical usage, it was simply how a son, of any age, addressed his father directly and warmly. It's worth being fair to Jeremias here too. This wasn't a case of a careless scholar inventing evidence out of nothing. He was working from a genuine linguistic observation that Abba has the simple, repeated syllable shape common to many languages' early childhood words for father. Compare how many unrelated languages independently land on similar simple sounds. Papa, Baba, Dada, for a small child's first attempts at naming a parent. Jeremias's mistake, as Barr laid it out, was treating that shape as proof the word stayed confined to childhood use, when the actual attested evidence showed grown men using it their whole lives. The word's origin in a simple childhood sound doesn't mean its ongoing use was ever limited to childhood. In the same way an English speaker's first attempt at a parent's name might be Dada, but the word doesn't stop being appropriate the day that speaker turns 18. Barr didn't argue that Abba was cold or purely formal. Either. He wasn't swinging the pendulum all the way to it's a stiff legal title. His actual conclusion sat in the middle. Abba was a term of genuine warmth and closeness, used across a person's whole life, carrying real relational weight, but not evidence of the specific, narrow claim Jeremias had built an entire prayer theology on, that this was specifically toddlers' speech. One more thing worth understanding about why the popular version has had such staying power. Academic corrections don't travel at the same speed as popular teaching. Barr's article was published in a specialist theological journal in 1988, read mainly by other scholars and seminary students doing detailed research. Jeremias's original claim, by contrast, had already spent nearly 2 decades embedded in sermon illustrations, devotional books, and worship songs by the time Barr's correction appeared. And those materials kept getting reprinted, quoted, and passed down through new generations of preachers who had learned the daddy version from their own mentors, often without ever encountering the specialist journal literature that had quietly walked it back. Even now, decades later, you can find recently published books and popular articles still repeating the original baby talk claim as settled fact, simply because it's the version that got embedded first and deepest into the popular teaching pipeline. This matters for a very practical reason. It changes what the New Testament writers were actually claiming when they quoted this word. If Abba is baby talk, the point of Romans 8 verse 15 is you get to be as small and dependent as an infant in front of God. If Abba is the normal, warm term a full-grown, legitimate son uses for his father his entire life, the point of Romans 8 verse 15 is something different. And once you look at the actual sentence Paul wrote around the word, something the surrounding context supports far more directly. Go back to the actual sentence in Romans chapter 8. Paul doesn't say, you have received the Spirit that lets you act like a baby. He says, you have received the Spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The word sitting right next to Abba in Paul's own sentence is a specific, loaded legal term, adoption, diathesia in the Greek, meaning the formal placing of a person into the full legal status of a son, with everything that status carries: name, inheritance, protection, and the unquestionable right to approach the Father directly. It also matters which verb Paul chooses for what happens with this word. He doesn't write that believers quietly whisper Abba. He writes that we cry. It, krasimon in the Greek, a strong, urgent verb used elsewhere in the New Testament for raised voices, for crowds shouting, for someone crying out under real pressure. That's worth noticing on both sides of the baby talk debate. It's not the picture of a timid, small voice murmuring a pet name. It's closer to someone calling out with full confidence that they will be heard, which fits the adopted, secure heir reading at least as naturally as it fits any image of childlike smallness. In the Roman legal and social world Paul's readers lived in, adoption wasn't a soft, sentimental family arrangement the way it's often pictured today. A Roman adoption was a formal legal transformation. An adopted son gained the full legal rights of a biological heir, sometimes even stronger rights, since Roman adoption was frequently used specifically to secure an heir whose loyalty and legitimacy could not later be challenged. The adopted son's old debts were legally canceled. His old family status was erased. He now had an unchallengeable legal claim to the father's name, protection, and inheritance. This wasn't an obscure legal footnote to Paul's original readers. It was one of the most visible political facts of their world. The most famous adoption in the Roman Empire's living memory was Julius Caesar formally adopting his great-nephew Octavian in his will, a legal act that transformed an 18-year-old into Caesar's legitimate heir and eventually into the Emperor Augustus. Roman emperors after him regularly secured succession the same way, adopting a chosen heir specifically because adoption carried full, unchallengeable legal weight, often stronger in practice than a merely biological claim. When Paul's readers in Rome heard the word adoption attached to their own relationship with God, they weren't hearing a soft metaphor. They were hearing the exact legal mechanism their own empire used to transfer real power, name, and inheritance from a father to a son who would carry his authority forward. Paul finishes the exact same sentence in Romans 8 by saying, "And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ." That's not incidental. That's the entire point of the passage: adoption, heirship, inheritance. Now hold both pieces together. James Barr's correction says Abba was the ordinary word a legitimate son, of any age, used for his father, not a baby's babble. Paul's own sentence says the reason we get to use that word for God at all is that we've been legally adopted as full sons with inheritance rights. Put those together, and the popular toddler reading and the corrected adult son reading point toward two very different pictures of what's actually being offered to you in this verse. The toddler reading says, "You get to approach God the way a baby babbles at a parent, total dependency, no real standing of your own, comforted mostly by your smallness and helplessness." The corrected reading says something with more weight to it. You get to approach God the way a fully adopted, fully legitimate son approaches a father whose name he now legally carries, with real standing, an unchallengeable place in the family, and the confident right to walk into the room and speak, not because you're small and cute, but because your legal status in the family has been permanently settled and cannot be revoked. That's not a less intimate picture. If anything, it's a more secure one. A small child's confidence in front of a parent can still be shaken by fear of being sent away, of not really belonging, of having to earn their place. An adopted adult son with settled legal inheritance rights doesn't have that particular fear available to him anymore. His place in the family isn't provisional. It's not something he's in danger of talking his way out of by saying the wrong thing in prayer. It's a status, not a performance. This also reframes the Gethsemane scene in Mark 14 in an interesting way. Jesus, in the worst moment of his life, praying in real anguish, doesn't reach for a formal, distant title for God. He reaches for Abba, the ordinary, warm word an adult son uses for his father, in the middle of asking for something he's not sure he'll get, and then submitting to his father's will anyway. That's not a toddler having a tantrum and being soothed. That's an adult son, in crisis, speaking to his father with the kind of direct, trusting closeness that comes from a completely secure relationship. Closeness that doesn't require formality to be real, and doesn't require childishness to be intimate. There's a related passage worth bringing in here, even though it doesn't use the word Abba itself. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16, which urges believers to draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Notice the word doing the work in that sentence. Confidence, sometimes translated boldness. Not the confidence of someone who has earned a place through good behavior, and not the helpless dependency of someone too small to be responsible for themselves, but the settled confidence of someone whose place in the room has already been secured by someone else's legal action on their behalf. That's the same posture Abba is actually pointing toward once you follow Paul's own argument in Romans and Galatians rather than the popularized nursery word version. Not smallness, but secured access. There's one more layer worth adding, because it's easy to miss. None of this means the word Abba was cold, distant, or merely legal on the ground, in daily life. James Barr himself was careful to say the opposite, that Abba carried real, everyday warmth, the kind of word a son would use walking in the door after a long day, not a term reserved for court documents. The correction isn't Abba was formal, not warm. The correction is more precise than that. Abba was warm and everyday and used across an entire lifetime by a legitimate son, carrying both the ordinary affection of family life and, in Paul's hands, the specific weight of adoption and inheritance. It's not one or the other. It's a term that could hold both at once, the way an adult can still say dad, with genuine warmth without anyone mistaking that for baby talk. So the corrected version doesn't cost you the intimacy the popular version promised. It just relocates where that intimacy comes from, not from being small and dependent, but from being fully, legally, permanently placed inside the family, with nothing left to prove. So what does this actually change, practically, the next time you pray? If you were taught the popular version, Abba means daddy, so pray like a trusting toddler. There's a real and good instinct underneath that teaching worth keeping. Come to God without needing to perform, without needing perfectly polished religious language, without holding yourself at arm's length out of fear. That instinct isn't wrong, and the corrected linguistics don't take it away. What the correction adds is a steadier foundation underneath that same instinct. You're not approaching God well because you've managed to make yourself small and dependent enough to be endearing. You're approaching him with standing you didn't earn and can't lose, the settled, legal, unchallengeable place of an adopted son who carries the family name now, permanently. Your access to speak isn't a performance of vulnerability. It's a status that was already given to you before you walked into the room. That's a sturdier thing to build a prayer life on than be cute and needy enough that God feels sorry for you. It's closer to, you belong here. Your place isn't in question, So say what you actually need to say, the way Jesus did in Gethsemane, asking directly for something he wasn't sure he'd receive, and trusting the relationship enough to submit either way. It also means the two readings aren't actually as far apart in the end as the academic dispute makes them sound. The popular version wanted you to feel like you're allowed to come to God without pretending to have it together. The corrected version gives you an even sturdier reason to believe that's true, not because God indulges weakness the way a parent indulges a toddler, but because your place in the family was never contingent on having it together in the first place. Both readings land on the same door. The corrected one just hands you a permanent key instead of a temporary pass. Most sermons that use this word never get to walk through where Abba means daddy actually came from, or that a formal linguistic correction to it has existed in the academic record for over 3 decades. Now you have both pieces, the popular version, where it came from, the correction, and what the correction actually implies about your own standing when you pray. If tracing widely repeated ideas back to their actual sources is something you want more of, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which other commonly repeated word study you'd want traced back to its real evidence next. Thanks for watching.